Charan Singh and the Green Revolution in Uttar Pradesh. We have the pleasure of having with us Professor Prakash Kumar, who is a professor of South Asian history at Pennsylvania State University. And he has been doing his research on this and similar subjects for decades. He is the author of an important book, Indigo Plantations and Science in Colonial India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. So, Prakash, a very, very warm welcome to you at Nehru Memorial. Uh, the topic of his lecture, Charan Singh and the Green Revolution in Uttar Pradesh, is significant for us in many ways. The first thing that is important here is that the Green Revolution is often not recognized or identified with Uttar Pradesh. Though, of course, many people do know about it, that Western Uttar Pradesh was also a part of the Green Revolution. But the discourse of the Green Revolution has been focused on Punjab and, of course, to a lesser extent, on Haryana. So that is the first thing I believe that is important about this topic. And second, of course, is the important role that Chaudhary Charan Singh played in the various debates and discourses that went on from 1940s to 1960s in the Congress circles and outside the Congress circles in Uttar Pradesh, which we know was the largest state in terms of population, and which was a stronghold of the Indian National Congress, and which was full of important leaders, tall leaders, as we were just saying. Govind Ballabh Pant, of course, was there as the tallest, probably in 1940s and 50s, and then Dr. Sampurnanand, Purushottam Das Tandon, Chandrabhanu Gupta, Chaudhary Charan Singh, and various others, and of course Sucheta Kriplani also became chief minister for considerable tenure. So I believe that what Professor Prakash is going to talk about is how, in the midst of that very, very complex ground level politics of Uttar Pradesh, in which various forces and various ideas were competing, Chaudhary Charan Singh had emerged as a leader who had a certain position about how farming should be done, what kind of reforms were required in the area of agriculture. And we know that he had written a very important book on the subject of Zamindari abolition in 1948. And he had certain very, very clear ideas about what kind of reforms were required in the countryside. For example, he was highly critical of the Nehruvian approach or Nehruvian focus on industrialization, and he thought that this was detrimental to the development of agriculture. And of course, he was also opposed to cooperative farming, which was one of those important Nehruvian ideas. So I believe that without any further delay, now I should invite Prakash to deliver his lecture on the subject.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And I'm, of course, delighted to be here. And I want to thank Dr. Ravi Mishra and Teen Murthy for giving me this platform to talk, to present my work. I should also thank Teen Murthy for safekeeping of Charan Singh papers that I was able to use and write my paper and chapter on. So in the interest of time, let me jump straight away into the topic. And I'm planning to speak for about 35-40 minutes and no more. So I am writing a book on the history of rural and agrarian modernization in India. And this talk is out of chapter 4 in that book. And it discusses, today's paper discusses two contesting visions for agricultural modernization in Uttar Pradesh after independence. One was represented by Charan Singh, and the other found representation in the birth of and in the early works of a major university that was set up in Rudrapur, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, which later on, after Pantji's death, came to be called Govind Ballabh Pant University. So much of my book is focused on Uttar Pradesh, except for chapter 5, which is on the Punjab. I couldn't have asked for a better contextualization of Green Revolution and its history and Charan Singh's importance than what Ravi offered, my friend Ravi offered. Another thing about Green Revolution, which we all know, but which remains to be historicized, is its American connection, the American push for the Green Revolution. What was their exact role? It comes up in activist literature. It may come up in Vandana Shiva's very powerful criticisms, but a historical analysis does not exist. And that's something that my book is trying to do. Of course, there is Akhil Gupta, but that's its ethnographic take on Green Revolution, not a historical one. So that's what my book is trying to do. Now, as you can see on the screen, this is Chaudhary Charan Singh, a very young Chaudhary Charan Singh in 1951. And I chose this picture because this is when he first got a cabinet rank in UP government. Before 1951 also, he was quite powerful. He was the parliamentary secretary to Chief Minister Govind Ballabh Pant. But 1951 onwards, his long reign within UP Congress government started, that lasted till 1967 when he quit Congress and formed his own party, different iterations of Lok Dal. He held very important portfolio. He held the revenue portfolio till 1959 and thereafter agricultural portfolio till 1965. These positions offered to him a unique opportunity to foist his agrarian ideology, his particular ideology on policy making, to launch major agricultural reforms, and on shaping Uttar Pradesh agrarian society. Now, we all know something about the Green Revolution. I want to focus on two things with regard to Green Revolution in today's talk. The first aspect of Green Revolution that I want to focus on is what I call Indo-US entanglements. You can call it cooperation, collaboration, hegemony, but I call it entanglements because there is power everywhere in those entanglements. Through the 1950s and 1960s, United States was involved in a major way in initiating rural and agrarian modernization in India through food aid in the 1950s, through technical expertise for community development, through building agricultural universities. I want to highlight, secondly, the Green Revolution paradigm as representative of one of the two trajectories of agricultural modernization in Uttar Pradesh. It was just one. The second one was this gentleman, Chaudhary Charan Singh ji. All right, this third slide is about the Green Revolution. What is the Green Revolution about? Green Revolution is pivoted around that particular super technology, high yield variety seeds, HYV, high yielding variety seeds, or you may have heard dwarf seeds. That is a super technology. It was a technology that was developed by Rockefeller Foundation supported program in Mexico and specifically tailored for India's needs. The breeders, this is not biotechnology, this is just conventional breeding. The breeders who set out to develop HYV seeds were after a target plant. They were trying to come up with a target plant with certain characteristics. A plant that would be super responsive to fertilizer application. More fertilizer you put in, more grains it oozes out. It was also dependent on very timely irrigation. After such number of days of fertilizer application, the plant needs water. That is why the agronomists at agricultural universities in Uttar Pradesh and in Punjab prepared package of practices for each seed that they developed for, out of HYV seeds. So once the HYV seeds came from Mexico, they had to be back crossed into Indian varieties, into Indian land races. And that's how every Sonalika, Kalyan Sona, all of these had to be prepared, and an aggregate of practices had to be created for it. So if you're planting HYVs, you must apply, look at this as a super technology. Look at HYV as a super robot. Now, if you don't power up a robot, it will not perform the function it is meant to perform. So if you're planting HYVs, you must apply requisite amount of fertilizers and timely irrigation, or else the plant will give you the same yield as the other land races, meaning it won't be the robot. It'll just be the humans. And some would say that's a good thing. Another part of developing this target plant through HYV seeds was to make it short. That's why the alternate name, dwarf varieties. What happens when you put a plant on steroid to produce so much grains that the plant can barely handle the weight of the grains? Imagine a skinny guy running with a lot of weight. What happens? He may fall. The same thing happened. The plant lodged. So lodging had to be prevented in this plant, which was producing profusely grains. And to do that, they made it shorter and they made it stocky. The stem was made stocky. Now, I'm giving you all these details just in order to explain the rigor of Green Revolution science, its comprehensiveness. Some would say its brutality on ecology and the natural environments. The last thing I want to focus in that list, if you can for a second look at that list, is the package program. HYV as a technology would not have thrived unless it was given as part of a package of policies. Why would the farmer want this technology? Why would she or he be willing to try out a new thing? Why should she or he risk using a new plant? Farmers are not known to have deep pockets where they can be reckless about the seeds they use. The government provided subsidized seeds, made it available at their doorsteps with the help of agricultural universities, extension networks, and cooperatives. The government enabled rural electrification to run the tube wells, provided bank loans to set up privately owned tube wells. The government invested money in rural roads and in creating mandis to sell the produce. The government provided cheap and easy credit through cooperatives. And lastly, as we all know, the government provided minimum support price to buy whatever farmers produced. All these were done to sweeten the deal. And the program was launched in northwestern states. Why? Because these were historically areas of high production and relatively assured irrigation. Now, as I said earlier, United States was quite invested in undertaking projects of agricultural modernization in India in the 1950s and 1960s. They were everywhere. They were providing food aid. They were in community development. They were into setting up IITs. They were in Green Revolution. They were, of course, into multi-purpose projects that we know, Bhakra Nangal, DVC. They were into fertilizer import of chemicals, and where their more immediate material interests were taken care of. We know of the inroads made by American and other Western MNCs that activists like Vandana Shiva talk about. But a narrow focus on such material and financial goals of America hides something much more comprehensive, and that is America's Cold War interests. America had certain geostrategic Cold War interests. Diplomatic scholars like this gentleman, Nick Calathur, historian, a great historian, have demonstrated that the American role in agricultural and rural modernization in India, including in promoting Green Revolution, was defined by an urge to prevent the spread of global communism. How did they get to this? This kind of a motivation stemmed from a keen realization in relevant circles in United States that India was hungry and a widespread ideological belief that hungry nations turned communists. As a democracy, India enthralled the Americans. After the Maoist revolution in China, after the so-called loss of China, India could be turned into a showpiece to illustrate that agricultural modernization was possible through a liberal democratic route rather than a collective route as in China. Prosperity was possible through democracy. Much of the American interest in India can be explained through the lens of this ideological belief. This is not story. This is true. This is the ideological belief that drove them. And this was not limited to just State Department. It was very deeply ingrained. It was among scientists. It was among breeders. Many American scientists, faculty who left their families, came here, worked for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. They have written very, detailed notes about their anecdotes, the time spent in India. They all talk about what motivated them to come to India. This is really history at the personal level. And this is history also at the structural level. You can see it at the level, operating at the level of diplomatic history. All right. So through the 1950s, India, and therefore Uttar Pradesh also as part of India, became overly dependent on American food grains. I'm quoting on the left from a story that was published in Times of India. The story was referring to American grains that were put on ships and sent to India. It was titled Ship to Mouth. American grains were distributed through public distribution shops, or PDS, in India. To the right is PL 480, Public Law 480. This was the paramount American legislation through which American surplus food was offered to many nations in the 1950s and 1960s. By late 1950s, by the way, India had become the top recipient nation in terms of amount of food it imported from USA. Despite gradual progress in agricultural production, India was short in terms of aggregate food needs throughout the 1950s and 60s, early 60s. And this gap had to be plugged. India asked almost all nations of the world. Nobody had surplus grains. Soviet Union was importing grains from United States. Canada and Australia offered some. But the only nation which had surplus grains in quantity India needed was the United States. Now, let's not look at it too much in terms of a humanitarian aid or something. There is a certain political economy at work here, and I want to focus on that. And this political economy served American interests and the interest of important post-colonial policies. The Midwest in the United States was the granary of the country. And in the 1940s and 50s, American farmers were overproducing. This agriculture was supported by federal subsidies. And the government also came back to purchase grains from the market because too much grains on the market would cause a glut, drop in prices, and federal government wanted to keep the farming bloc happy. The federal government gave incentives to American farmers to cut back on production, and they did not succeed. So it kept intervening in the market, buying this grain and storing it in federal granaries in the 1940s and 50s, especially 50s. In the 50s, United States federal government was investing $1 million a month, 1950s prices, just to maintain that stock. Then they came up with this idea that this food can be used for certain instrumental ends. It could be used to align foreign nations to United States geostrategic goals. Keeping India democratic, at least in their mind, to push back against global expansion of communism was the key policy agenda item in the United States. And that's what drove them to provide food aid to India in the 1950s. I'm sure there are other things. History is layered. Causality, historical causality is layered. I'm not ruling out that there were no people who, I have looked at papers of people who believed in their religion, who genuinely believed that they were going to do the task of God. So you cannot discount such motivations at individual level, but as historians, we're also looking at the larger forces. And that's the larger reality, the Cold War reality. What's happening in India? Distribution of subsidized food through PDS allowed Pandit Nehru's administration to embark upon an industry-led development program, which Dr. Ravi Mishra was alluding to. While the limited investment in agricultural improvement through the 50s, cheap American food could be distributed to urban poor, to marginal rural classes, and could be used for market interventions to keep prices down, food prices down. This was a win-win for political classes in the United States and in India. Incidentally, it was the policy of industry-led development that Charan Singh's political outlook pushed against. Charan Singh stood for economic development through agricultural prosperity. More on that in a bit. The second route that the Americans took to influence agriculture in India was by sending their faculty, university faculty, from their land grant institutions. Very broadly, the agricultural colleges in United States, land grant institutions. Government of India set up two very powerful committees in the 1950s who were to settle the modus operandi to suggest changes in agricultural research and education in India. US agriculture had been evidently transformed through its land grant institutions. And now, these two committees decided to embrace the land grant model in India. Between 1955 and 1972, 5 land grant institutions in the United States were engaged, recruited by USAID, United States Agency for International Development, to send their faculty to India to help set up agricultural universities. The plan was initially 1 agricultural university in each state. I'll just show you a few pictures so that we can get out of this routine of a monologue. If you see, this is a publication from University of Missouri to the left. It's talking about, different parts of India being divided between different land grants. It's a painful picture to look at because, as you can see, the administrative boundaries, the state boundaries of India are ignored. What you see, there are boundaries of American hegemony. To the right is Kansas State University, a terminal report after 16 years in India. Penn State faculty in India, in Maharashtra state, 1950s. Empire of knowledge, perhaps here you can see how they have divided the country into different influence zones. At least it talks to you about their mindset. I mean, it's not everyone is talking about this, but this is one publication, but at least in one pamphlet you have this. And that was because the 5 land grants were given different regions of India to focus on, to develop agricultural universities and to develop other resources for agricultural modernization. My research focuses on 2 agricultural universities. In chapter 4, I focus on Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, set up in 1960. And in chapter 5, I focus on Punjab Agricultural University in Ludhiana, which was established in 1962. Both of these played a key role in bringing the Green Revolution to India. So here are the 2 competing visions of agrarian and rural progress that I'm considering. The vision of Charan Singh as a local politician in Uttar Pradesh that pursued reforms and hoped to change rural society through reforms. And second, the technocratic perspective, the technocratic vision of Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, let's call it UPAU. If not opposed, these two were in a state of disconnect, total disconnect with each other. Here is Chaudhary Charan Singh. Let's start with Chaudhary Charan Singh. Chaudhary Charan Singh had a deep legislative agenda to his credit. It started with Agricultural Produce Market Bill, which he introduced as a private bill in the nationalist government of United Provinces in 1938. He was a prominent member of Zamindari Abolition Committee, which submitted its report in 1948. He went after Patwaris between 1953 and 55, who were often corrupt and diluted the rights of tenants in record books. He went for land consolidation, Chakbandi. He later fought with Govind Ballabh Pant over extension of Zamindari Abolition Act to hilly areas. And finally, Charan Singh was responsible for Agricultural Produce Marketing Bill in 1964. Now, a coherent political thought formed the spine of these multiple legislative efforts by Charan Singh. At the foundation of Charan Singh's thought was his belief in peasant proprietorship and a quest for creation of economic holdings. Fundamentally, he believed that if the cultivator owned his land and had individual stakes in it, if intermediaries were removed, and if the cultivator had unrestricted access to market to sell his produce, widespread agricultural prosperity would result. Let's not get into whether this is right or wrong. This is what Charan Singh believed in, right? So this is a historical statement on what he believed at that point of time. This belief drove his politics of reforms in the 1950s. A related desire was in the creation of, as I said before, economic holdings. He wished to get rid of what he called overburdened agriculture. He always said agriculture is overburdened in Uttar Pradesh, where far too many people were dependent on a piece of land. In an early pamphlet from 1939, a pamphlet that I looked at here, Charan Singh wrote, "The peasant who owns his holding has been known to cultivate it more efficiently than the one who is merely a tenant at will. Security of tenure is therefore the sine qua non of efficient agriculture and a contented peasantry." This is key. This is Charan Singh's definition of efficiency, not a technocratic definition of efficiency. You make the peasant a proprietor, have a stake in her or his land, give him or her access to market, he will turn productive. He was most critical of landlord-tenant tenure system and considered the landlord a social parasite. A zamindar performed no useful social and economic function in the agriculture of the nation. So this conviction of Charan Singh, and here is where we have to locate Charan Singh within the Congress agrarian vision of those times. This was anchored pretty much in Congress's 1945 manifesto, Congress Manifesto on Land and Agriculture. It said, "The land shall in future," and I'm quoting, "the land shall in future be allowed to be owned only by him who is prepared to cultivate it himself. It shall be regarded not as an object of financial speculation or as a source of rent providing an unearned income for its owner, but as a definite and limited means for employing the labor of a class of citizens whose regular occupation is the tilling of the soil." They wrote very long sentences, sorry. It was insistent that the rights of non-cultivating classes or owners who lived on rent or trade in land shall be liquidated. Charan Singh was appointed to Zamindari abolition. He remained committed to this idea. He was Govind Ballabh Pant's lieutenant in the passing of the law and later in defending the act against propaganda and court rulings. In fact, he later on developed differences with Pant, as I said earlier, over extension of Zamindari Abolition Act to hilly areas of Kumaon, which Pantji represented. A deepening rift with Congress, as Dr. Ravi Mishra was alluding to, a deepening rift of Charan Singh with Congress came, and with Nehru in particular came, over the latter's preference for cooperative farming, which, to Charan Singh's mind, diluted ownership to land. He was opposed to cooperative farming because in his mind, cooperative farming diluted individual ownership to land. Charan Singh also opposed cooperative farming because he thought it would lead to large farms, brute mechanization, tractors and combines, which to his mind were not suited to Indian conditions. There is a side note to his opposition to mechanized farming, which indeed mechanized farming came up in a big way in Tarai, right under his nose. And because of lack of time, I'm not discussing it, but it is explained, in my book. So Charan Singh favored small farms, mostly managed with family labor. He believed not in efficiency of land, but in the efficiency of individual cultivator. This is his very unique definition of efficiency. He continued to practice what I call dissident politics, wherein while he remained within the Congress, he continued to chart his own course and most of the time had his own way. Now, just to sum up all these ideas, there are many strands in Charan Singh's advocacy and agrarian politics, but some of them are pretty stable. One, advocacy of the countryside. Two, the politics of rural versus urban. Now, politics not in a narrow sense of politicking, but as in giving representation to concrete interests. Three, and this is also very important, at a theoretical level, an abandonment of the idea of a linear historical transformation from rural to urban, from agriculture to industry. Four, and lastly, a belief in agriculture-led development, or in other words, economic development through agricultural prosperity. Now, by the mid to late 1950s, Charan Singh's legislative agenda had been met. Soon after, however, Charan Singh began to have an increasingly uneasy existence within the Congress. UP Congress had its own share of, Ravi and I were joking about it, that we use the same word, tall leaders of the stature of Govind Ballabh Pant, Rafi Ahmad Kedwai, Sampurnanand, Banarsi Das, Tandon, Chandabhanu Gupta. But after Govind Ballabh Pant moved to the center in 1954, there was a void in political leadership in Congress in Uttar Pradesh. And many of these leaders were in contention to fill that void. Charan Singh, over a period of time, found his political ambitions clipped, and he expressed a sense of denial. If you look at his writings, one of the interesting things about Charan Singh is that he was, to my mind, a rare intellect. He wrote profusely, and he expressed his ideas in a very coherent way. So it is possible for us scholars to get to his mental outlook and analyze him on the basis of his writings and not on the basis of what he did politically alone. So that's a unique access. And, for all those of you who want to look at Charan Singh papers here, you should certainly do that. So Charan Singh's political ambitions are clipped. There is another thing which happens, the Nagpur resolution of Congress in 1959, where the party professed commitment to agricultural development through cooperative farming, which seemed to have provided an ideological breaking point to Charan Singh. Congress's faction-ridden political machinery reached a boiling point by the time an outsider, he called Sucheta Kriplani an outsider, was anointed the chief minister in 1963, again overlooking Charan Singh's claims to chief ministership. Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University. Now, meanwhile, while Charan Singh is busy in his reform agenda, US-India entanglements, which I started my talk with, grew exponentially in the 50s in Uttar Pradesh. And they were manifested prominently in rural parts of the state. Try to think of the general rural history of Uttar Pradesh at this time. The pilot projects for community development were started at Etawah, 1946 to 48, at Allahabad Agricultural Institute, agronomy, home science, and extension faculty from University of Illinois started to teach in the 1950s, first with Ford Foundation's help and later with US State Department's help. There was an important treaty that came in 1954, the India-US Treaty of 1954, that specifically provided for collaboration on agricultural education and research. Two key Indo-US teams were formed to suggest the path forward in India, and they all embraced the land grant model. They all believed, the members on this committee, overwhelmingly Indian members, believed that land grant models was certainly one way to go forward. Hanna, he was the Dean of College of Agriculture. In 1954, he was appointed advisor to UP state government, agricultural advisor to UP state government. He wrote on the request of Govind Ballabh Pant, a booklet called Blueprint for a Rural University in India, 1957. Govind Ballabh Pant wanted India's first agricultural university to be set up in Uttar Pradesh. He was by now the home minister. He was powerful. And he also wanted this university to be located in Tarai, which was being cleared around this time. 100,000 acres of land was available. So he wanted the agricultural university to be based there. Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University started functioning from 1960 as India's first agricultural university. Okay, it was missing one of the pictures, but that's okay. So the decade of 1960s was eventful in many ways for the history that I'm trying to tell. Is this mic okay?
No,
okay. Sure. The 1960s were eventful for this history that I'm trying to tell. One, agricultural production in Uttar Pradesh that had shown a slow upward trend in the 1950s started to show a decline. I think I'm missing 2 slides from there. Why is it so? Okay. Anyway, let's forget it. So one thing that starts to happen in 1961, 1962, and 1963 is that there is a clear drop in agricultural production in Uttar Pradesh. Second, Charan Singh was increasingly uncomfortable in the Congress government, and his actions were now being explicitly marked as being that of a dissident. These were the formative years of UPAU, and multiple factors impacted its destiny. To be precise, UPAU, now I'm focusing on the university. UPAU remained true to its land grant credentials, but increasingly moved away from the foundational principles of land grant. Land grant principles were about improving rural life, creating employment for rural population in various fields through education, not just agriculture, and to create employment for rural and to develop rural leadership. Instead of this, UPAU took upon the responsibility to directly participate in the national drive for raising food production. This happened in the context of food production failures nationally and the central government's decision to go for HYV experiment under new agricultural strategy from 1964 to 66. UPAU, the university, marshaled its resources to play a key role within this paradigm. The university completely molded its research, teaching, and extension activities to achieve the ends of high-yield agriculture using HYV seeds. It also spearheaded a plan to produce seeds, first on its own state farm, and then launched a large operation to produce such seeds through participation of progressive farmers all over Tarai. Entire Tarai was turned into a producing granary for the Green Revolution. It was producing seeds for the Green Revolution. A number of things happened between 1960 and 1964 that allow us to capture the distance between Charan Singh's vision for agricultural modernization in Uttar Pradesh and the technocratic vision of the university, UPAU. UPAU hired as its first VC a trained ICS person who had made his career within agricultural bureaucracy in Uttar Pradesh. KAP Stevenson. He's the one who is on the left extreme. He's slightly shaded by on the margin, but he's standing and giving a speech. And this is on the, this is in February of 1963 during a workshop that was called at Pantnagar University, and at which Charan Singh and the VC got into a back and forth. And this back and forth, their conversation and contestation crystallizes the differences between the two visions that UPAU and Charan Singh espoused. Now, notably, in 1960s, UPAU did not get the funds for its expansion. It was set up in 1960 with major grant from central government, but its maintenance grant was supposed to come from Uttar Pradesh. But those funds did not come. There is reason to believe that Agriculture Minister Charan Singh's lack of enthusiasm for UPAU was a factor in this. Denied funds, UPAU came up with its own model of self-financing. It used its 12,000-acre farm to produce hybrid seeds of maize. Those of you who have lived through that period would remember those white sacks with Pantnagar seeds written on top of them, distributed all over India. A dedicated seed production program was launched at Pantnagar University in 1962. And this seed production initiative was aligned with HYV seed production program after 1964. When imported Mexican varieties were backcrossed into Indian land races at 3 centers, it was done at IARI here in Delhi, Jauntia village, also in Delhi now, and at Pantnagar farms. So this is the picture of a rare workshop where this back and forth between KAP Stevenson and Charan Singh took place. The workshop was called by UPAU to discuss the role of agricultural universities in India in light of UPAU's 3 years of existence and in a context where such universities were coming up all over India. Charan Singh, as Minister of Agriculture and Animal Husbandry, 1963, was the chief guest who gave the inaugural address in the presence of US Ambassador J.K. Galbraith and D.S. Kothari, Chairman, University Grants Commission, and several other important scientists and educationists from all over India. In his inaugural address, Charan Singh expressed his skepticism to what he called imported models. And he apparently saw UPAU as an instance of precisely the same, an Americanist institution which had to prove its worth in the Indian context. Acknowledging that agricultural universities set up in India are patterned after the land-grant colleges of America, he reminded the audience that, and I quote, "While we borrow from other countries, we should not for a moment lose sight of the peculiar conditions prevailing in this country." His suggestions to the audience all stemmed from his core misgivings. He had certain misgivings. What were they? They're very important for knowing what was he not liking about Green Revolution. One, his misgiving was that higher learning often made students from rural areas abandon rural society, abandon farming, and move to urban areas. Two, technocratic solutions must be in line with India's needs, which had surplus of labor and less capital. Three, that the youth had a fatalistic outlook about rural India, and no effective rural leadership was emerging. These were his major reservations. So summing up, he thanked Americans for their aid, but he also said, and I quote him, all kind of aid is welcome, but an aid which contributes to popular enlightenment is particularly so, unquote. His speech could not have been more tepid. And the prospects of UPAU in UP. The Vice Chancellor stood up in response, and he put up a strong defense of what was being accomplished by his university. There was no outright emphasis on an American idea, he suggested. In fact, integration of research, teaching, and extension, this core American idea of land grants. In fact, he said, integration of research, teaching, and extension was an idea that had worked in several countries. It is a method applicable to all countries, irrespective of farming conditions and the size and nature of farms. Therefore, the criticisms were unfair and based on misunderstanding. I admire his courage to say so much in front of the agriculture minister. No wonder he lost his job soon after. He argued that a university like UPAU must be autonomous and shielded from political interference, and mentioned the attacks the university had faced from, quote, bastions of privilege and conservatism. Everyone claimed to be fighting in the name of popular and against privilege of one form or the other. Stevenson was making the case for, and this is something that I go into more detail in my book, that what is this technological terrain and how do you keep the political out of it? I mean, Dipesh Chakrabarty's article, In the Name of Democracy, is a fundamental one here. Stevenson was making the case for an apolitical space where technology could be put to use for solving the nation's problems. He showed his allegiance to the national agenda, mentioning that Union Agriculture Minister S.K. Patil had given the remit to the university and its cadres to forget about fundamental research, publications, and to focus instead on solving the real problems of agricultural production. He showed his university and its staff it's committed not to their professional advancement, but rather to serving the needs of the nation. The nation was passing through an emergency, and the national emergency had brought into sharp focus the vital role of agricultural production. He gestured towards the national role UPAU had to take up. Yeah. Okay. Give me no more than 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you. Stevenson's term came to an end, and possibly not seeing an eye to eye with the agriculture minister in the state, he did not seek reappointment. In his place, the university's board of management put up a new VC who is apparently a political appointee, Raja Bajrang Bahadur Singh from Himachal Pradesh, and he remained the vice chancellor from 64 to 66. He was widely known to be close to the agriculture minister. Let's digress here just a little bit. In the meantime, Charan Singh's position was becoming untenable within the Congress party. In November 1963, he wrote to the chief minister asking to be divested of agriculture portfolio. And the stated reason was that this portfolio has been degraded. Fertilizer and seed distribution is being done through cooperatives. Extension is being done through community development. So he wanted either an amalgamation of 4 portfolios: agriculture, community development, cooperatives, and cane development, and all 4 of those to be given to him if Sucheta Kriplani wanted him to continue. But others dissented, charged him with ambition. Few others demurred on practical grounds, stating that many portfolios could not be assigned to one minister, overlooking claims of other aspirants. Charan Singh stuck to his demand. There was another reason that was bothering him, and this is important. He was particularly aggrieved, as what he writes clearly, about failure of agriculture on the production front, something that I alluded to, and I lost that slide because it had all the figures for 1961, 62, 63. The production in agriculture production in Uttar Pradesh tanks, and this is just mirroring a national trend. Production is coming down instead of going up. His budget speeches of 1961, 62, and 64 tried to explain away these failures and to put them at the doorstep of adverse weather, which was partly true. But regardless, he was very wary of taking any blame for this failure under his watch. And therefore, he wanted to quit agriculture. He said he would be happy with just forests, which was actually done in 1965. As I said before, this stopped. Yes, this is, I got it. Food grains production in UP in lakh tons. You can see this. This is actually coming down. The failure that Charan Singh admittedly spoke of was real. So in 1965, Charan Singh leaves his agriculture portfolio. He's not ready to take the blame for this failure. On the other hand, at UPAU, Sucheta Kriplani fires Raja Bajrang Bahadur Singh as the vice chancellor. And she appoints in his place another trained ICS person, back to technocratic, Dhyanpal Singh, who remained UPAU's Green Revolution vice chancellor through the 1966-65 years. It is not coming, but anyway, this is the last slide and some of my concluding remarks. So under DP Singh said, a farm is like a factory. He likened HYV seeds to machines in the factory. He wrote a book called Uttar Pradesh and the Green Revolution in 1970. He looked at discovery of hybrid vigor as more significant and revolutionary than the discovery of atomic power. And he's the one who was responsible for setting up Tarai Development Corporation in 1970, led by UPAU, in partnership with National Seeds Corporation and a large cooperative of large farmers, so-called progressive farmers. Tarai was turned into a producer of Green Revolution seeds. So this is it. I'll just leave you with one parting thought. So was Charan Singh's intervention completely ineffectual in the larger story of Green Revolution? Not quite. The resistance to Green Revolution ideas represented by Charan Singh ensured that consequences of UPAU's efforts in implementing a Green Revolution type of agriculture were largely limited to the area around Tarai in Uttar Pradesh. Green Revolution had a limited expanse in Uttar Pradesh. But in neighboring Punjab, which is what my chapter 5 deals with, under Pratap Singh Karon, the Green Revolution model found a complete political support for its development and realized its fullest potential and pitfalls. Potential and pitfalls. I will end here. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much for this marvelous lecture. We are now open to questions and comments. Please take the mic.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. That was very enlightening, especially for me who's a UP wala.
If you could speak a bit louder because
Yeah,
we have online.
especially for me who's a UP wala, grew up there. And my father was in fact a civil servant, a senior civil servant, and Charan Singh was his chief minister. So I have some personal interest in the subject, and as an economist, I have an even deeper interest in the subject. I wanted to understand from you. I somehow might have missed this. What exactly was this American land grant model? Maybe you spelled it out, and I didn't. I missed that, or perhaps it was not spelled out. The second and a more important, far more important actually, subject is a question is the following. About Charan Singh's sort of quote unquote conflict with the American approach, which you spelt out in the beginning. A priori one would think, why is Charan Singh opposing this? After all that the Americans are proposing is a technocratic solution, which, if as agriculture minister, he was to adopt it, and the farmers in India were to, the peasantry that he was a spokesperson for, was to adopt it, then it would be all for the better. But I gathered, I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I kept looking for the answer to this question, which was arising in my mind as you spoke. So what's wrong with Charan Singh? Why is he opposing this? And then later, towards the end, you mentioned the fact that the UPAU was promoting the distribution of seeds through the cooperatives, and his problem was the cooperatives, not because he was a spokesperson for the peasant proprietor and he was a great advocate of the zamindari abolition and so on, which is fine. And then I think you mentioned community development programs; they also had a role. So his opposition was to that vision rather than to the technology per se. Is my understanding correct? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Let me go first to what is land grant. So the land grant model, it owed its origin to two acts in the United States: 1862 Morrill Act and then 1914. Very simplifying it a little bit, these land grant institutions were set up by giving the federal government gave land grant to certain universities to be set up, public universities. And the idea was to situate them in rural far-off areas so that they would take education to the rural areas. So the ideal was not agricultural production, it was education to the rural areas. And in fact, the Radhakrishnan Committee, when it was enchanted, Radhakrishnan Committee in 1949, the first higher university education committee, when it gave its report in 1949, it was enchanted by land grant model because it saw Gandhian sensibilities in those. Let's take education to rural areas. But UPAU turned it upside down. They said they started collaborating with University of Illinois in the name of land grant, but they completely overturned the land grant ideals. They turned themselves into a tool of the post-colonial state, into engaging in agriculture production. One may say, what's wrong with it? And I wouldn't have that discussion because I'm a historian. I'm just here to explain. But what I'm saying is that what happened because of that UPAU's nature changed. To understand Charan Singh's conflict with UPAU, one has to get into his vision of an agrarian society. What is an agrarian society? An agrarian, Charan Singh in many ways was closer to Gandhi than Nehru. Charan Singh believed in small proprietors, agriculture based on small proprietors, done with family labor. Charan Singh was for small technology. Charan Singh he was not completely Gandhian. He would accept industry, but only in the end, small industry, middle industry, and then large industry, if at all. But his vision was of an agrarian India. And this thing becomes much more clearer in my book, because that's why in chapter 5, I go to Punjab, which is beyond my comfort zone, because I'm basically a historian of Uttar Pradesh. So the difference between Uttar Pradesh and Punjab is the following. Charan Singh's vision, and I consider Charan Singh to be the tallest leader as far as agriculture is concerned for Uttar Pradesh. Charan Singh's vision is that of an agrarian India. Pratap Singh Karon's vision is that of an agriculture-supported, industrialized Punjab. If you get that distinction, then you can understand what's Charan Singh's problem with the technocratic model.
Yes, please. Kindly introduce yourself.
I'm Jakpal Singh. I taught political science at IGNOU, and I'm a student of agrarian politics. I've been following Charan Singh's writings for past around 3-4 decades.
Wow.
Since 1980s, in fact. Charan Singh, if you look at him, he was, of course, a politician, but he was an intellectual also. Terry Byers has, pointed out, he was the first scholar to say that Charan Singh was a Chinaman, intellectual, but he was an strategist also. And his strategy, in fact, was shaped by the timings. And in fact, he wanted to cultivate and protect the middle peasant or peasant proprietors. And if he faced challenge from any side, he handled that and very ruthlessly. One was this, which you have pointed out. And in fact, I must congratulate you. I think this is the first kind of lecture I'm hearing on Charan Singh or on agrarian changes in UP. Second was that he was also struggling within the Congress party. And we have his papers here when he, in fact, was devising his agrarian strategies. He was consolidating his base in Eastern UP and Central UP. He was not concentrating on Western UP, particularly among the backward classes, Yadwas and Kurmis. And then he faced challenge from within the high caste leadership of Congress party, including Dr. Sampurnanand. And then there were accusations from both sides. They were accusing him of helping the backward classes, and he was accusing them of helping the high castes. And then, in fact, Sampurnanand, the senior leaders of the Congress party, they said that Charan Singh's policies are harming us. And the people he's supporting, they will rather vote for the socialist parties, not for us. So this was, that means on both fronts, he was handling his challenges on the technological front also and on the social front also. But his main purpose was to protect his own social base. When we come into the post-Green Revolution period, my understanding that Charan Singh was also changing with the time. Of course, he was very rigid, but he was also changing. And maybe today, if Charan Singh comes back, his ideas will not be relevant. We do not have that peasant proprietors. Sorry.
Thank you. I think that's more of a comment. Any question? Any comment? Yes.
One question. I'm Dr. Sanjeev Gautam from the manuscript section. You might have studied the papers of our section, Chaudhary Charan Singh papers. They are in 3 installments. I thank you for studying those papers. But when I saw or properly listened to your thought, I found that you were talking about the difference between the Punjab and UP. Why the model of UP failed instead of Punjab model. And we enjoyed the lecture because we found certain kind of new dimension. You discussed about the engagement of US aid to the Green Revolution that we received in our country. And earlier we were not actually aware of all this kind of particular dimension. So let me thank on behalf of all of us that you discuss this new angle to the audience, please.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? Okay, we'll wait. I think there are some people online also. They might want to ask, but before that, I think we have raised hand. Yes, Utsav Chaudhary.
So my name is Utsav Chaudhary. I'm currently pursuing MS Sociology in University of Hyderabad. So I want to know what are the current gaps in research on Chaudhary Charan Singh politics and intellectual idea. Where can I focus on?
What are the current gaps? Okay, yes. I think one major gap that I identify is that of our failure to look at his writings. I think I mentioned during my talk that I found Charan Singh, and he's written so profusely. He's written so many books and pamphlets and articles going back to 1938-39, and he published in newspapers, which are all available. You just have to look hard for them. What happens is that when you look at his writings, you get a different vision into his mindset. You get a rare perspective into what he thinks and how he thinks and what does he want. As rightly pointed out by over here, Charan Singh faced many constraints. He was isolated within UP Congress. Many times he talked about denial, and he talked about denial in terms of his social origins within the Congress party. So many things he was not able to do. What he was not able to do, you can find in his writings. What he really wanted to do and could not do, you can find in his writings. So I would say that an intellectual history approach or intellectual political scientific approach, political ethnography would be a very, very interesting and productive area going forward.
Thank you. A couple of small questions of my own. You made this, of course, very interesting and very important observation that Charan Singh is closer to Gandhi. And by the way, we have the oral history transcript of Charan Singh here. I'm sure you would have seen. And Charan Singh does make that claim. Uh, and the fact is that the non-technocratic agrarian vision that Charan Singh was uh, professing and promoting does appear to be in some way closer to the Gandhian vision of an autonomous rural society as against the the technocratic model which was the dominant model accepted at the time of independence under the leadership of Pandit Nehru. And in fact, Charan Singh criticizes that very much in his oral history transcript, which we have here. And he says that these people don't really know the village, and therefore, I'm sure you would be familiar with that. All that is well taken. I understand that point. However, one thing in which I find Charan Singh's model so different from the Gandhian model is that Charan Singh is imagining a rural society which is made uh, predominantly of people who own land. So, and he does not look into the history of the forms of exclusion through which people were dispossessed of land. You see, you cannot understand the agrarian condition of India in 1947 without understanding the history of how, during the previous 150 or 200 years of British rule, people were dispossessed of land in various ways. In Punjab, of course, this happened on a large scale, as we know, because of the legislative policies and other measures taken by the British. But this happened in many parts of India, especially in Uttar Pradesh. Now, Charan Singh makes a very interesting claim, and I think it is factually correct that the percentage of rural population which was landless was much less in Uttar Pradesh as compared to Punjab or Tamil Nadu, etc. And of course, we know it from independent sources also. However, the limitation of Charan Singh's vision, which though he has acquired certain things from Gandhi, seems to be that he wants to, in some way, stop at the peasant proprietor, the farmer, so called, somebody who owns some substantial amount of land, but he does not want to go beyond that. For example, he opposes Land Ceiling Act, and he says that if you sort of distribute land to everybody, it is not going to benefit anyone, it is going to harm agriculture, and it is not going to help even the poor, etc., etc. So now the people who, this is my own conclusion, that the people who were promoting technocratic solutions, obviously they were not totally opposed to what Charan Singh was saying. In fact, there is a continuum between the two. They were also, in fact, within the Congress there was a consensus in favor of land reforms and agrarian reforms, but what form should they take and how should agriculture develop, about that of course uh, there were differences among them. So the, I think, in a way, both had some merit to their side, because those who believed in this technocratic solution somehow thought that the agrarian model, which was earlier, of course, promoted by Gandhi, but in a different form, it was being promoted by Charan Singh now, it might be able to benefit a certain section of the rural society, but not the entire society. I would like to get your comments on this. Second point, very briefly, I would like to make. You say that in Punjab, Green Revolution was accepted enthusiastically by Pratap Singh Karon, and therefore it is spread throughout the Punjab. Whereas in Uttar Pradesh, it was geographically confined to areas that were closer to the Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University. I wonder if this geographical sort of constraint on the Green Revolution in Uttar Pradesh was because of this. I mean, the lack of enthusiasm or opposition of Charan Singh, or was it because the conditions for the high yield varieties of seeds, the agriculture, water, and of course a certain degree of availability of capital with the farmer for spending money on irrigation and on HYVs and also on fertilizers, etc. And the fact that it was, the western Uttar Pradesh, which was the wheat belt of the state. And by the way, Uttar Pradesh produced much more wheat than Punjab and Haryana until recently. Even now, I believe Uttar Pradesh produces about 35% of the total wheat of India, if I'm not wrong in this. So, what was it?
Great question. So let me first get to the Gandhi question. I mean, yes, he claims affinity to Gandhi, and he does have differences from Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi's take on rural society, some would say, was even civilizational. You know, I think Charan Singh's approach to rural society is much more class assessed. It looks at it in terms of classes. And one of the charges that was leveled against Charan Singh is that he was a supporter of kulaks. And that's a charge he hated the most. He hated it so much that he wrote an entire book about it, that he's not a supporter of kulaks, right? But there is a certain kink in his armory, as my friend Ravi pointed out. He does not talk about labor, right? I think in one of the questions that Paul Brass did a lot of oral interviews with him. And in one of the questions, he says, what about agricultural labor? And he says, well, agricultural labor does not own a land, so he's not a farmer. He was very dismissive about it.
And in fact, he says, if I may interrupt you, that as far as agricultural labor is concerned, the wages are driven solely by demand and supply. So there he supports that market thing, But when it comes to land, I mean, abolition of zamindari and of course ownership rights to the tenants, there he takes a different approach, which is driven by the, yes, please continue, by the power.
No, absolutely right. And I'm glad you pointed out. Yep, totally agree. Your second question is absolutely on the money. I mean, it is totally true. For purposes of this talk, I only focused on Charan Singh. But of course, Charan Singh is not the only reason that this Green Revolution does not spread. It does not spread pure and simple because Eastern UP is very different from Western UP. Secondly, Green Revolution was a package. There's not so much about HYV seeds as it is about state investment. State invested in certain parts of the country, and Western UP is what it shows. Without government's resources, Green Revolution could not have moved forward. Not even in Punjab, farmers had the resources to put all of this together for this kind of agriculture. And it was only federal government resources and state government resources that bankrolled it. And therefore, absolutely, Eastern UP was out of it. And of course, since then we have had these new efforts at extending the Green Revolution to eastern parts. And, we have seen that the kind of roadblocks they're facing even today as they're trying to extend the so-called Green Revolution to eastern parts of the country.
I think with this, we have reached the end of today's lecture and discussion. Once again, I take this opportunity to thank all those who are present online and with us in the seminar hall. And of course, I take this opportunity once again to thank Professor Prakash Kumar and for accepting our invitation and for delivering this very interesting, insightful lecture on an important subject. I have a couple of announcements to make about the talks that we have in the near future. On 1st July, we have a talk by one of our fellows, Dr. Jahira Khatun, on the notion of Advaitism in Mandukya Upanishad. And then on 19 July, we have a talk by Dr. Ajay K. Mehra, former Atal Bihari Vajpayee Fellow and MML, on H.D. Devegowda, an underrated Prime Minister. And on 29th of July, we have a talk by one of our junior fellows, Varada Shambhus, on the subject Singing Glories of God to Attain Swaraj, Reflections on Rashtriya Kirtan Tradition in Maharashtra. I hope that some of you would be able to join these talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And